One of the biggest topics when it comes to Messianic prophecy is the topic of typology. And you don't have to hear typology very much or be in this world very much before you begin to realize that definitions of typology are really all over the map. And people refer to different things as types of Christ, and it all seems rather confusing. And so what I want to do in this session is take a look at this topic of typology and then kind of flesh that out through looking at a passage from the New Testament. I think before we really can wrap our minds around what typology is, we need to ask the question about what typology is not. First of all, typology is not allegory. Allegory is, for the sake of our purposes, we'll define it like this. It is a story that utilizes both actions and images to suggest a secret or a hidden meaning. I think perhaps to help us understand what allegory is, it would help to read an allegorical interpretation from Augustine of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Listen to what Augustine says. He says this: "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho." Adam himself is meant. Jerusalem is the heavenly city of peace, from whose blessedness Adam fell. Jericho means the moon and signifies our mortality because it is born, waxes, wanes, and dies. Thieves are the devil and his angels, who stripped him, namely of his immortality, and beat him by persuading him to sin, and left him half dead, because insofar as man can understand and know God, he lives, but insofar as he is wasted and oppressed by sin, he is dead. He is therefore called half dead. The priest and the Levite who saw him and passed by signified the priesthood and ministry of the Old Testament, which could profit nothing for salvation. Samaritan means guardian, and therefore the Lord himself is signified by this name. The binding of the wounds is the restraint of sin. Oil is the comfort of good hope. Wine, the exhortation to work with fervent spirit. The beast is the flesh in which he decided to come to us. The being set upon the beast is belief in the incarnation of Christ. The inn is the church, where travelers, returning to their heavenly country, are refreshed after pilgrimage. The morrow is after the resurrection of the Lord. The 2 pence are either the 2 precepts of love or the promise of this life and of that which is to come. The innkeeper is the Apostle Paul. The payment is either his counsel of celibacy or the fact that he worked with his own hands, lest he should be a burden to any of the weaker brethren when the gospel was new, though it was lawful for him to live by the gospel. Wow. That is a lot of reading into the text. And I think we would have to read something like that and say, surely not every one of those pieces were part of what Jesus intended when he taught the parable of the Good Samaritan. No, this is allegory. An allegory is a story that has a hidden or secret meaning. That's not what we mean when we talk about typology. Typology is also different from symbol. A symbol is a historical event or fact that can be seen as a source of moral, spiritual, or theological truth. So we could say for us, living in the United States of America, the Statue of Liberty is a symbol of freedom. Typology, then, is different from both of these. Typology is this: things in the Old Testament that correspond with things in the New Testament that, when looking back, seem like they point forward to something greater. I know this definition may sound a little bit confusing now, but I think it'll make more sense as we begin to work through this. G.K. Beale has written a book, Handbook on the New Testament use of the Old Testament. And several times throughout the course of these videos, I will mention this resource. In my opinion, this is one of the greatest resources that you can get your hands on for the study of Messianic prophecy. It's relatively short, only about 150 pages. It's pretty thick. It might take some time to work through some of the chapters, but I think what you will find is that if you're really interested in this, this book will be greatly rewarding for your study. G.K. Beale in this book details what he believes are several essential characteristics of a type. For me, I don't necessarily think we need to include all of the ones that he did. I've boiled them down to a list of three. Three things that I think are necessary in order for us to determine that something is a type. And so when we speak of typology, I think there are three things that a type must have. And since I want to make it easy for us to remember, I've created an acronym, OLD, O-L-D. After all, we are studying the Old Testament. And so the O stands for occur in history. If we suspect something might be a type, the first question to ask is, does this occur within history? The second question then to ask, does this look forward? Does this seem to point forward to something coming in the future? And then 3D is that it is developed later. The idea here is that later on within Revelation, this idea is developed or built upon. And so, in order to be a type, we must find that any passage meets these three criteria: occur in history, looks forward, and is developed later. What I want to do now then is flesh this out by going to a passage within the New Testament. We're going to take a look at John, chapter 19, verse 36. This passage is a text that comes at the end of John's gospel. We find ourselves standing there with John as he watches the crucifixion of Jesus. It's really an incredible account as John kind of gives us this gruesome detail of Jesus as he's led out of the city, as he's thrown down on the cross, as they put his arms out and drive the nails into his hands, as they hoist him up between the two criminals. We stand there as John watches Jesus' mother weep at the foot of the cross, as we watch Jesus suffer and groan in pain and suffering from the cross. And then we are there with John as Jesus sighs, "It is finished," and breathes his last. John tells us then that something interesting happened. You see, it was the day of preparation, John says, and so the religious leaders didn't want these bodies wasting away on the cross for a day, and so they decided to go ahead and expedite their death. So the soldiers started going around and breaking the legs of the people who were dying on the cross. Of course, if your legs are broken, you're not able to hoist yourself up to catch your breath, thus probably expediting the death process. And so they do this with the people on the side of Jesus, and yet when they come to Jesus, they find he is already dead. And so, presumably as proof that this happened, the soldiers take a spear and they thrust it into Jesus' side. Listen to what it says in John chapter 19, verse 34. One of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. Verse 35, he who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you also may believe. For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. Of all passages of scripture, why did John choose this one? This is an interesting question, and I think it will become more interesting for us as we realize where exactly John went in the Old Testament to find fulfillment of this messianic prophecy. The quotation actually comes from the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 12, verse 46. If you remember, in the book of Exodus, we have the people of Israel who are enslaved in Egypt. God sends Moses to them to bring them out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. 9 plagues are inflicted upon the Egyptians. And then God tells Moses, I will send one final plague. Before I do, though, I want you to gather the Israelites, and I want you to have them choose a lamb, one lamb from the flock. I want you to keep it, and then when I tell you, I want you to have them all slaughter the lamb. Take the blood that you've drained from the animal and smear it on the doorposts of the house. Take the lamb inside, you need to cook it, and then you will eat it that night. And then, when I pass through the land of Egypt to strike down the firstborn of all of the Egyptians, I will see the blood on the door, and I will pass over, or I will cover and protect your house. And so the people do it, and God does it. He moves through the land, and he strikes down the firstborn of all the Egyptians. However, just after the aftermath of this event, God speaks to Moses again and says, what you just saw and what you just did this is going to become a regular festival as a part of your life as you move out now as a nation. Every single year, you need to remember this and observe this as a people. We will call this the Passover Celebration. And so, in God giving these instructions to Moses, we find Exodus chapter 12, verse 46. This is what it says in verse 43. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it. Every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. No foreigner or hired worker may eat of it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house. And you shall not break any of its bones. Surely now we have to scratch our heads a little bit. Why would Jesus be referred to as not having any of his bones broken when in the original context this actually referred to an animal? Perhaps John is just ripping this passage out of its Old Testament context. I think if we look a little bit closer, we can see the connection. First of all, notice that the lamb was innocent. It was without blemish and it had done nothing wrong. God specifies then that this lamb is to be slaughtered, and yet make sure that the bones are not broken. This is very important. Then you are to take the blood that has drained out, and you are to put it on the doorposts of your house, and in so doing, you will cover the wrath of God that is coming upon the Egyptians. And so, as the people throughout history remembered the Passover celebration, they remembered that God had acted in history to save them from his wrath through the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. Every year, they would remember this. In fact, we find in the book of Numbers, chapter 9, verse 12, this same idea. There, now in the wilderness, God gives more instructions to the people about how they are to observe the Passover. And this is what he says. Numbers chapter 9, verse 11. In the second month, on the 14th day at twilight, they shall keep it. That is Passover. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall leave none of it until the morning, nor break any of its bones. According to all the statute of the Passover, they shall keep it. In other words, this piece is important enough for them to remember that God tells them, once again, you need to make sure that none of the Passover lamb's bones are broken. Later on in history, though, we find something interesting happening. You see, not only was this idea remembered from year to year, but when we reach the book of Psalms, we find David reflecting on the life of the righteous person who suffers, actually alluding to the Passover lamb in reference to himself. Listen to what it says in Psalms chapter 34. I'll start in verse 19. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, David says, but the Lord delivers them out of them all. he keeps all his bones. Not one of them is broken. The idea here seems to be that David is looking at the Passover lamb as what we might even call a type or an image of a righteous sufferer, someone who suffers even though they don't deserve it, and yet in the process are somehow made more righteous through the action. In fact, this interpretation really seems to have taken hold throughout Jewish history. There was a later Jewish book written called Jubilees. It was written probably 100 or 200 years before the birth of Jesus. And listen to how the book of Jubilees describes the Passover. It says this: "They shall not cook it with water, nor shall they eat it raw, but roast it on the fire," that is the lamb. "They shall eat it with diligence, its head with the inwards thereof, and its feet they shall roast with fire, and not break any bone thereof, for of the children of Israel no bone shall be crushed." You see, this early Jewish writing was even reflecting on the Passover lamb and seeing it as a picture of the righteous suffering of the people of Israel. And so, as we approach the New Testament, I think we have to ask the question, what then is John doing? Why is he using the text in this way? Well, what I think John is not doing is saying that Exodus 12:46 was actually not about a lamb, but about Jesus. No, I think Exodus 12, verse 46 is about a lamb. But that's the idea. The lamb is a type of Christ. Now, how do we know this? Well, I think we have to run through our criteria for typology. First of all, does this occur in history? Exodus 12, verse 46 is a historical account. Yes, it does occur in history. But second, does it look forward? Well, the very fact that it's part of the regular celebration of the Passover suggests that it does, in fact, look forward to the future. Then third, is it developed later? And yes, I think we have to look at passages like Numbers chapter 9, Psalm chapter 34, and say that the people of Israel were interpreting this themselves as a type of what was to come. And so, I think it does meet our criteria for a type. Notice then how John sets up his gospel. The rest of the gospels have Jesus eating the Passover with his disciples before his death. In John, the Passover actually comes on the evening after Jesus dies. I think probably this is because perhaps at this time in history they had kind of an individual Passover you would celebrate with your close friends and family. That's what Jesus eats with his disciples. And yet there was also kind of this national celebration of Passover, which was celebrated on the next day. And that seems to be what all of the religious leaders are preparing for as they say this is the day of preparation, and thus we don't want the bodies left hanging on the cross. The idea then is this. At the very moment that people in Israel are sacrificing the Passover lamb and remembering all of these things that were true of that Passover lamb, Jesus, who is innocent, is crucified on a cross. Not only that, but they don't break any of its bones. None of Jesus' bones are broken. Also, we find immediately after Jesus' death that as he stabbed in the side, blood and water flowed out. I think probably this is a physiological reality, but John is deeply theological. And when he tells us this, I think he's telling us more than just what he saw. I think he's telling us what it means. The blood flowed from Jesus' side because, in fact, Jesus is the Passover lamb. And just like the Passover lamb served to cover the wrath of God in the pages of the Old Testament, so Jesus, the Passover lamb, covers the wrath of God in the pages of the New. because of what Jesus has done. Now, once, forever, the people of God are freed from the wrath and the punishment that we deserve. And so, Exodus chapter 12, verse 46, within John chapter 19, verse 36, is not a direct one-to-one prophetic fulfillment, but rather it seems to be an indirect fulfillment, or what we might call typology. There's a type here that is fulfilled here. And so, because Jesus is the Passover lamb, we have life. And the reality of this surely should lead us to worship the Lamb.